At 3:17 a.m. on the morning of January 3rd, 2026, a formation of United States Special Operations helicopters crossed into Venezuelan airspace over the darkened outskirts of Caracas, heading toward a residential compound in the heart of the capital. Within 47 minutes, Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, was in American custody, extracted from his own country in a nighttime raid that the Pentagon would later describe as flawless in execution. What happened in the hours, days, and weeks that followed did not just reshape Venezuela. It shattered the last illusion that any oil-rich authoritarian regime can defy the United States Navy and survive. And what almost nobody is telling you is that the raid on Caracas was not the beginning of this operation. It was the final act of a campaign that started months earlier, not with soldiers, not with aircraft, but with oil tankers. The United States did not simply remove Maduro from power. It strangled his regime's ability to function long before a single boot touched Venezuelan soil. And the method it used, a maritime blockade of sanctioned oil vessels across the Caribbean, revealed a blueprint for projecting American power that the world has not seen deployed at this scale since the Cold War. To understand why this matters beyond the borders of Venezuela, consider what was at stake. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, an estimated 303 billion barrels of crude, roughly 17% of the entire global total. That figure exceeds the reserves held by Saudi Arabia. It exceeds the reserves held by Iran. It exceeds the reserves held by the United States itself by a factor of 5. For decades, that oil was supposed to be Venezuela's ticket to prosperity, its insurance policy against the world. Instead, it became the instrument of the regime's destruction. Under Hugo Chavez and then under Maduro, Venezuela's state oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela, known as PDVSA, was systematically hollowed out through corruption, mismanagement, and political interference so severe that the country's oil production collapsed from 3.5 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to barely 1 million barrels per day by the time the United States moved. PDVSA's own internal assessments acknowledged that the company's pipelines had not been updated in 50 years. The cost to rebuild Venezuela's oil infrastructure to anything approaching peak capacity was estimated at $58 billion. The regime was sitting on the largest oil reserves in human history and could barely get a fraction of it out of the ground. That is not a country with leverage. That is a country with a target on its back. This is the context that made Operation Southern Spear possible. Not just the military dimensions, though those were extraordinary. The economic suffocation that preceded the kinetic operation is the part of this story that changes the strategic calculus for every authoritarian regime that depends on energy exports to survive. In September of 2025, the United States began tightening the screws. The initial moves were quiet, almost administrative in nature. Treasury Department designations expanded the list of sanctioned vessels associated with Venezuelan crude. Intelligence agencies tracked the shadow fleet, those aging tankers that sailed under false flags with transponders disabled, shuttling Venezuelan oil to buyers willing to ignore American sanctions. The network was extensive. Dozens of vessels, many of them previously sanctioned for involvement in Iranian oil smuggling through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, were now carrying Venezuelan crude through Caribbean waters. The connection between the Iranian shadow fleet and the Venezuelan shadow fleet was not coincidental. It was the same network, the same vessels, in many cases the same crews, repurposed from one sanctions evasion operation to another. On December 10th, the first seizure occurred. The crude oil tanker Skipper, flagged out of Guyana, was intercepted in the Caribbean Sea off the coast of Venezuela by United States Coast Guard assets. The Skipper had been sanctioned by the Treasury Department in 2022 for alleged involvement in an oil trafficking shadow fleet linked to the IRGC and Hezbollah. The Venezuelan government immediately condemned the seizure, calling it an act of international piracy. United Nations Security Council members urged restraint, and several UN representatives expressed concern about the legality of the naval blockade. Analysts noted that United States actions tested the boundaries of international maritime law. The condemnation changed nothing. The Skipper remained in American custody. Subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris right now and turn on notifications, because what happened next moved faster than any news cycle could track, and the developments that followed changed the entire strategic picture in the Western Hemisphere. Within days of the Skipper seizure, the effect rippled through the shadow fleet with remarkable speed. Several oil tankers en route to Venezuela made immediate U-turns or halted their navigation entirely. Captains who had spent years navigating the gray zone of sanctions enforcement suddenly faced a binary calculation. The reward for delivering Venezuelan crude was measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars. The risk was measured in the permanent loss of a vessel worth tens of millions. By December 24th, only 2 tankers carrying PDVSA crude had even attempted to enter international waters, and one of those, the Centuries, was also intercepted. More than 30 ships sitting in Venezuelan ports that were sanctioned by the United States could potentially be seized if they attempted to leave. The blockade was working with a speed and efficiency that caught even experienced maritime analysts off guard. The most dramatic confrontation involved the tanker Marinera, formerly known as the Bella I, a vessel with a history entangled with Russian sanctions evasion. When the United States Coast Guard attempted to board the Marinera in late December, the crew resisted. The vessel made a U-turn and attempted to flee. Then something remarkable happened. A Russian flag was painted on the hull of the ship on December 31st in what United States officials described as an apparent attempt to claim protection from Moscow. International law is explicit on this point. Ships are not permitted to change their flags mid-voyage unless there is a change of ownership or registration. The vessel appeared on the Russian Maritime Register of Shipping under its new name, Marinera, complicating the legal picture but not the strategic one. The maneuver was desperate, and it was illegal. Russia responded by sending a submarine and additional naval vessels to escort the Marinera, creating a standoff in the North Atlantic that echoed in miniature the kind of naval confrontation that defined the Cuban Missile Crisis. 2 United States officials confirmed that plans were developed to interdict the vessel despite the Russian escort. The officials stated that the United States would rather seize the ship than sink it, and that the operation could mirror the boarding of the skipper. On January 7th, those plans were executed. United States European Command confirmed that the Coast Guard cutter Monroe tracked the ship ahead of its seizure pursuant to a federal warrant. United States forces boarded the Marinera in the North Atlantic, seized the vessel, and handed control to law enforcement officials. The Russian escort, for all its symbolic menace, did not intervene. Not a confrontation, a capitulation. That seizure was the third. The fourth came on the same day, January 7th, when the Panama-flagged M. Sophia was taken in the Caribbean Sea. United States Southern Command described it as a stateless, sanctioned, dark fleet motor tanker. The M. Sophia had been running with its transponder disabled for approximately 5 months, invisible to commercial tracking systems, but not to American military surveillance. On January 9th, the fifth seizure followed in a pre-dawn operation. Marines and sailors launched from the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, boarding and capturing the tanker Olena, which was flying the false flag of Timor-Leste. The Olena, previously named Minerva M, had been sanctioned by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem released footage of the seizure and declared that the ghost fleets would not outrun justice. By January 15th, a sixth tanker, the Veronica, was seized in defiance of what the administration called a quarantine of sanctioned vessels. By January 21st, a seventh tanker, the Sagitta, had been taken without incident. 7 tankers seized in 6 weeks. The trap worked. The cumulative effect of these interdictions was devastating to the Venezuelan regime's ability to function at the most fundamental level. As excess crude accumulated with no buyers willing to risk American seizure, PDVSA began draining onshore storage into oil tankers anchored offshore in a desperate attempt to avoid cutting production. It was not enough. On December 28th, PDVSA began shutting down wells in the Orinoco Belt, the vast deposit of heavy crude that represents the backbone of Venezuelan oil production. Shutting down wells in the Orinoco Belt is not like turning off a faucet. The crude is dense, viscous, and requires constant processing with diluent chemicals that could no longer be imported because the sanctions had cut off supply just to flow through pipelines. Once those wells go cold, restarting them requires months of technical work and enormous capital expenditure. Some wells, once shut, never reopen. That is not a temporary disruption. That is permanent damage to a nation's productive capacity. The financial mathematics were punishing beyond anything the regime could absorb. Venezuela had been producing approximately 2 million barrels per day before the blockade. At global prices hovering near $60 per barrel for Brent crude, that represents roughly $66 to $72 million in daily revenue, or approximately $2 billion per month. The blockade did not reduce that revenue gradually. It severed it. The regime's ability to pay its security forces, to maintain its patronage networks, to fund the Cuban intelligence advisors embedded throughout its government, to import the basic goods that kept a crumbling economy from total collapse, All of it depended on oil revenue that was no longer arriving. Without money, loyalty evaporates. That is the entire point. And here's where the strategic architecture of the American approach becomes fully visible. The United States did not need to destroy Venezuela's oil infrastructure. It did not need to bomb refineries or sink tankers. It simply needed to make it impossible for anyone to buy Venezuelan crude without risking the seizure of their vessel by the most powerful navy on earth. The Shadow Fleet, which had been the regime's lifeline for years, became its critical vulnerability overnight. Every tanker that sailed was a target. Every captain who accepted a cargo of Venezuelan crude was gambling his ship against the United States Coast Guard and the United States Navy, operating in concert across the entire Caribbean basin and the Atlantic approaches. The only company that could move Venezuelan oil freely was Chevron Corporation, operating under a specific license from the United States government. Chevron's spokesperson confirmed that the company's operations continued without disruption throughout the entire blockade and military operation. That detail is not incidental. It is the architecture of the new arrangement made visible in a single sentence. American companies operate, everyone else asks permission. Two intelligence officials also revealed something that has received almost no coverage in the mainstream press. Venezuelan officials had discussed placing armed military personnel on tankers, disguising them as civilians for defensive purposes, and had explored the possibility of mounting portable Soviet-era air defense systems on commercial vessels. These discussions took place before Maduro's capture, indicating the regime understood the blockade was existential. That escalation never materialized. The capture of Maduro ended the discussion before it could become action. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell, because the next phase of what is unfolding in Venezuela will determine the energy map of the Western Hemisphere for the next decade. And the decisions being made right now will affect oil prices, gasoline costs, and the strategic balance of power in ways that are only beginning to become visible. Now, here's the dimension that most analysis is missing entirely, and it changes everything. The military operation against Maduro, as dramatic as it was, succeeded in part because the economic operation had already hollowed out the regime's capacity to resist. By the time Special Operations Forces arrived in Caracas on January 3rd, the Venezuelan government was running on fumes in the most literal sense imaginable. The oil revenue was gone. The Shadow Fleet was scattered or seized. The wells were shutting down. The regime's allies, Russia and China, had demonstrated through their actions and their inactions that they were unwilling to confront American naval power directly to save Maduro. China's response was particularly instructive for anyone watching the global balance of power. Beijing controls more than 90% of the global refining capacity for rare earth minerals and maintains deep economic ties to Venezuela, including backing PDVSA financially and embedding itself in mining operations producing critical minerals used in advanced weapons systems. Iran had reportedly established drone manufacturing facilities on Venezuelan soil. Russia had deployed military advisors. Venezuela had become a strategic outpost for rival powers in the traditional American sphere of influence, precisely the kind of development outlined in Trump's 2025 national security strategy, which marked a shift from post-Cold War policy toward what the administration called America First realism. China had every economic incentive to resist the American blockade. It chose not to. The calculation was straightforward. Confronting the United States Navy in the Caribbean over Venezuelan oil shipments was not worth the risk to China's broader economic relationship with the United States. Beijing condemned the operation diplomatically and then began quietly repositioning to negotiate access to Venezuelan resources through whatever new arrangements Washington was constructing. Russia's response followed a pattern that should alarm every nation that depends on Russian security guarantees. The submarine escort of the Marinera was theater. When American forces actually boarded the vessel, the Russian Navy did not fire a single round. It did not intervene. It watched. The message was received clearly in Tehran, in Damascus, in Havana, and in every capital that has been told that Russian partnership provides protection against American pressure. When the moment of actual confrontation arrives, Moscow performs solidarity. It does not deliver it. The aftermath moved with extraordinary speed that underscored how thoroughly the blockade had broken the regime's will. On January 5th, Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's former vice president, was sworn in as acting president. Trump stated that Rodriguez had told Secretary Rubio that Venezuela would do whatever the United States needed. Within weeks, Rodriguez announced that the United States was unfreezing funds related to 2019 oil sanctions. Reuters reported that Citgo, the American refiner, purchased Venezuelan crude for the first time since 2019. Secretary of State Rubio stated publicly that the United States was executing a deal to take control of Venezuelan oil sales, with revenues deposited into accounts under American oversight and Treasury Department audit. Energy Secretary Chris Wright stated that the United States intended to maintain significant control over Venezuela's oil industry, including overseeing the sale of the country's oil production indefinitely. By February, diplomatic relations had been restored, and the American embassy in Caracas reopened for the first time since its closure in 2019. More than 621 political prisoners were released. An amnesty bill covering political detentions from 1999 to the present was approved on February 19th. The Energy Information Administration projected that Venezuelan oil production could return to pre-blockade levels by mid-2026, assuming expanded United States licenses continued. But returning to pre-blockade levels means returning to approximately 1 million barrels per day. That is less than a third of what Venezuela produced before the socialist regime dismantled its oil industry over 2 decades. The gap between what Venezuela has in the ground and what it can actually produce represents tens of billions of dollars in required infrastructure investment that will take years, possibly a decade, to execute. American oil companies, the same companies whose assets were seized by Hugo Chavez in 2007, are now positioned to return under terms dictated entirely by Washington. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips have outstanding arbitration awards totaling an estimated $20 to $30 billion in unpaid compensation for assets seized during the nationalization campaign. Those claims have not disappeared. They have become leverage in the reconstruction negotiations, representing approximately 10 to 15% of Venezuela's total international debt obligations of nearly $200 billion. The broader implications extend far beyond Venezuela's borders and into the strategic calculations of every oil-dependent authoritarian state on Earth. The operation demonstrated that the United States possesses the capability and the willingness to impose a maritime blockade on a sovereign nation's oil exports, seize vessels in international waters, remove a sitting head of state by force, and restructure an entire country's energy sector, all within the span of weeks. For Iran, which depends on the same shadow fleet networks to evade oil sanctions and which watched some of its own former vessels seized in the Caribbean, the precedent is direct and unmistakable. For Russia, which has built its own expanding fleet of dark tankers to circumvent Western sanctions on its crude exports following the invasion of Ukraine, the message is equally clear. The United States Navy has demonstrated, with 7 seized vessels as proof, that it can find, track, board, and capture sanctioned vessels anywhere in the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the North Atlantic approaches, even when those vessels are sailing under Russian escort. The question that remains unanswered, the one that will define the next chapter of this story, is whether the reconstruction of Venezuela's oil industry will actually succeed or whether the largest proven reserves on Earth will remain permanently stranded. PDVSA's infrastructure has deteriorated to a degree that petroleum engineers describe as catastrophic. The technical workforce has largely fled the country, part of a diaspora of more than 7 million Venezuelans who left during the Maduro years. The heavy, sour crude of the Orinoco Belt requires specialized refining capacity that exists primarily along the United States Gulf Coast, where refineries were originally built decades ago to process exactly this type of oil. Most American refineries operate significantly more efficiently when processing Venezuelan heavy crude compared to domestic light crude. If American companies succeed in rebuilding Venezuelan production toward historical levels, the impact on global energy markets would be transformational. An additional 2 to 3 million barrels per day entering the market from a Western Hemisphere source would fundamentally alter the supply dynamics that currently give OPEC its pricing power. It would reduce American dependence on Middle Eastern crude in ways that reshape the entire geopolitical map. It would create a new revenue stream measured in hundreds of billions of dollars, flowing through American-controlled channels over the coming decades. But that is a timeline measured in years, not months. And in the interim, the global oil market is already oversupplied by an estimated 2 million barrels per day, according to the International Energy Agency, with OPEC unwinding voluntary cuts totaling nearly 4 million barrels per day. Brent crude has slipped to approximately $60 per barrel. The market may not even need Venezuelan crude at the prices that would justify the massive investment required to extract it. The economics of reconstruction depend on oil prices that the reconstruction itself would suppress. The clock is running. The wells in the Orinoco Belt that went cold during the blockade are deteriorating with every passing week. The diplomatic arrangements being constructed between Washington and Caracas remain fragile, dependent on the continued cooperation of a Venezuelan government operating under terms it did not choose. The next round of negotiations between American oil executives and Venezuelan officials will set the framework for contracts worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And every rival power watching, from Beijing to Moscow to Tehran, is recalculating what it means to depend on shadow fleets and sanctions evasion networks that the United States has now proven it can dismantle at will. The parallels to Operation Praying Mantis in 1988, when the United States Navy destroyed half of Iran's operational fleet in a single afternoon to enforce freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf, are impossible to ignore. That operation proved that testing American resolve in critical waterways produces predictable and devastating outcomes. Operation Southern Spear has now extended that lesson from the Strait of Hormuz to the entire Caribbean basin. The operation is over. The consequences are just beginning. Drop your analysis in the comments below. Do you believe American oil companies can rebuild what Chavez and Maduro destroyed, or is Venezuela's oil wealth permanently stranded beneath the Orinoco? Will China and Russia accept being shut out of Venezuelan resources? Or will the next confrontation make the Marineris standoff look like a rehearsal for something far more dangerous? The answers to those questions will shape global energy security for a generation, and this channel will be here the moment it happens.